When I walked into my kitchen that Tuesday morning and found Carmen Rodriguez making coffee in my designer robe, using my favorite mug, I knew my marriage was over. What I didn't expect was for her to smile sweetly and say she'd be staying indefinitely while her own place was being renovated. 24 hours later, her husband David received a very interesting phone call from me, along with some photos that changed everything. Let me tell you why Carmen's renovation suddenly became the least of her problems. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The August sun was already blazing through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my Scottsdale home when I heard unfamiliar laughter echoing from my kitchen. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming. Ryan had left for his construction site at dawn, same as every weekday for the past 8 years of our marriage. The house should have been empty except for me. I patted down the travertine hallway in my silk pajamas, the ones Ryan had bought me for our last anniversary, past the gallery wall of photographs documenting our life together. Vacations in Sedona, dinner parties with friends, Ryan's arm always draped possessively around my waist. The woman I saw reflected in those pictures looked happy, secure, blissfully unaware of what was coming. The laughter grew louder as I approached the kitchen, mixed with the familiar sound of my expensive espresso machine grinding beans. Someone was definitely in my house, someone who knew their way around my appliances. My heart hammered against my ribs as I rounded the corner, prepared to confront an intruder. Instead, I found Carmen Rodriguez standing at my marble countertop, wearing my silk robe, the burgundy one with hand-embroidered details that I'd splurged on during a girls' trip to San Francisco. She was humming softly to herself as she operated my espresso machine with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this many times before. Her dark hair was tousled in that perfectly imperfect way that takes 20 minutes to achieve, and she was drinking from my favorite mug, the ceramic one Holly had made for me in her pottery class. Carmen looked up when she heard my footsteps, and instead of the shock or embarrassment I expected, her face broke into a warm, almost friendly smile. "Good morning, Natalie," she said, as casually as if we were old friends meeting for coffee. "I hope you don't mind. I made myself at home. Your espresso machine is incredible." I stood frozen in my own doorway, trying to process what I was seeing. Carmen Rodriguez, the marketing executive I'd met exactly twice at Ryan's company parties, was standing in my kitchen wearing my clothes and acting like she belonged there. My mouth opened and closed without producing sound, like a fish gasping for air. "Ryan mentioned you'd be up soon," Carmen continued, taking another sip from my mug. "He had to leave early for the Henderson project, but he said to tell you he'd call later." She gestured around the kitchen with obvious appreciation. "I can see why he loves this place so much. You have exquisite taste in everything." The compliment felt like a slap. "Thank you," I managed to croak, though what I was thanking her for I couldn't say. "What exactly are you doing here, Carmen?" Her smile never wavered. "Oh, didn't Ryan tell you? My condo is being renovated, complete gut job, you know how it is. When I mentioned I was looking for temporary housing, he was sweet enough to offer your guest room. I'll only be here a few weeks, maybe a month at most." The words hit me like a physical blow. Ryan had invited another woman to stay in our home without mentioning it to me. Not just any woman, but Carmen Rodriguez, who I now realized had been looking at my husband with more than professional interest at those company gatherings. The way she'd laughed a little too loudly at his jokes, stood a little too close during conversations, complimented his work with an intensity that seemed personal rather than professional. "I see," I said slowly, though I didn't see anything clearly. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of this violation of our most intimate space. "And Ryan didn't think to discuss this with me first?" Carmen's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something that might have been pity crossing her features. "I'm sure he meant to," she said gently. "You know how busy he's been with the new development. Men aren't always the best at communication, are they?" The patronizing tone in her voice made my skin crawl. She was talking to me like I was a naive child who needed basic relationship dynamics explained to her. In my own kitchen, wearing my clothes, drinking from my mug. "Where exactly is your husband during your renovation?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. Carmen's hand tightened, almost imperceptibly, around the mug handle. "David's traveling for work," she said. "Some big audit in Denver that's keeping him away for weeks. You know how it is with corporate accounting, always putting out fires somewhere. It didn't make sense for him to arrange temporary housing when he's barely in town anyway." Something about her explanation felt rehearsed, too smooth. I filed that observation away for later consideration. "Well," I said, forcing what I hoped was a pleasant smile, "I should probably shower and get ready for work. I have a client meeting this morning." "Of course," Carmen said brightly. "Don't let me keep you. I was thinking of making pancakes later if you're interested. I found all the ingredients in your pantry, hope you don't mind." She was going through my pantry, making herself at home in a way that suggested this wasn't her first morning in my kitchen. How long had this been going on? How many mornings had I left for work early, unaware that another woman was moving through my house like she owned it? "That sounds lovely," I lied, backing toward the hallway. "Maybe later." I climbed the stairs to my bedroom on unsteady legs, my mind spinning with questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. In the safety of my master suite, I sat on the edge of the bed Ryan and I had chosen together 3 years ago, and tried to make sense of what I'd just experienced. Ryan and I had been married for 8 years, together for 10. We'd built a life that looked perfect from the outside, our success stories intertwining like threads in an expensive tapestry. I'd started my interior design business from nothing, working 16-hour days to build a reputation in Phoenix's competitive luxury market. Ryan had parlayed his construction background into a thriving real estate development company, specializing in high-end residential projects. We were the couple other people envied. Beautiful home in Scottsdale, successful careers, regular vacations to Europe and the Caribbean. Our social media was filled with pictures of romantic dinners, weekend getaways, and professionally staged shots of our impeccably decorated home. We attended charity galas, hosted dinner parties, and maintained the image of a power couple who had it all figured out. But sitting there in my bedroom, listening to Carmen humming in my kitchen below, I realized how long it had been since Ryan and I had truly connected. When was the last time we'd talked about something other than schedules and logistics? When had we last made love instead of simply having perfunctory sex? When had I stopped being his wife and become just another beautiful accessory in our carefully curated life? The signs had been there, I realized with growing horror. Ryan's longer hours, his increased irritability when interrupted during phone calls, the way he'd started guarding his phone like it contained state secrets, the business trips that seemed more frequent, the colleagues I'd never met despite being married to the man who worked with them daily. I'd attributed it all to stress. Ryan's company was expanding rapidly, taking on bigger projects with tighter deadlines and higher stakes. It made sense that he'd be distracted, overwhelmed, focused on work to the exclusion of everything else. I'd been supportive, understanding, giving him space to handle his responsibilities. What a fool I'd been. My phone buzzed with a text message. Ryan's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment my heart leaped with hope. Maybe there was an explanation, a misunderstanding I could clear up with a simple conversation. "Hope Carmen's settling in okay? Thanks for being so understanding about the temporary arrangement. Love you." The casual tone of the message, the assumption that I'd simply accept this invasion of our home without question, made my hands shake with anger. He hadn't even asked. He'd presented this as a done deal, expecting me to smile and accommodate his needs without considering my feelings or comfort. I typed and deleted a dozen responses before settling on something neutral. No problem. Talk later. But there would definitely be a problem, and we would definitely talk later. I just needed time to figure out exactly what kind of problem Carmen's presence represented and how I was going to handle it. I showered and dressed for work mechanically, my interior designer's eye automatically coordinating colors and textures while my mind raced through possibilities. Perhaps I was overreacting. Maybe Carmen really was just a colleague in need of temporary housing, and my imagination was running wild based on a few suspicious details. But as I applied my makeup in the master bathroom mirror, I caught sight of something that made my blood run cold. On the marble countertop next to Ryan's sink sat a tube of mascara I'd never seen before. Expensive mascara, the kind that cost $60 and came in distinctive silver packaging. Carmen wore that brand. I'd noticed it at the last company party when she'd complimented my eye makeup and mentioned her favorite products. The tube was sitting there casually, as if it belonged, as if Carmen had been using this bathroom regularly enough to leave her personal items scattered around. The guest bathroom was downstairs, near the room where Carmen was supposedly staying. There was no reason for her mascara to be in my private bathroom, unless she'd been spending time in my bedroom. In my bed. I picked up the tube with trembling fingers, noting that it was nearly empty, well used. This wasn't something Carmen had brought for a brief stay. This was evidence of an ongoing presence in my most intimate space. The sound of Carmen's laughter drifted up from the kitchen again, and suddenly I couldn't breathe. I needed to get out of the house, away from her casual appropriation of my life, before I did something I'd regret. I grabbed my purse and car keys, calling out a goodbye that I hoped sounded normal. Carmen's cheerful response followed me out the door, wishing me a wonderful day, as if she were the lady of the house sending her guest off to work.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The drive to my design studio in downtown Phoenix usually calmed me, the familiar route giving me time to organize my thoughts and prepare for the day ahead. But this morning, every red light felt like torture, giving me more time to obsess over what I'd discovered. My studio occupied the ground floor of a converted warehouse in Roosevelt Row, Phoenix's arts district. I'd chosen the location deliberately, wanting to establish my business somewhere creative and dynamic rather than in a sterile office building. The space reflected my design philosophy, with exposed brick walls, polished concrete floors, and carefully curated furniture that showcased my aesthetic without overwhelming potential clients. Holly Chen was waiting for me when I arrived, sitting in one of my Italian leather chairs with a cup of coffee and a concerned expression. Holly had been my best friend since college, a sharp-tongued lawyer who specialized in family law and had an uncanny ability to read people's emotional states. "You look like hell," she said without preamble. "What happened?" I collapsed into the chair across from her, suddenly exhausted despite the early hour. "Carmen Rodriguez is living in my house." Holly's perfectly arched eyebrow shot up. "The marketing woman from Ryan's company? The one who looks like she stepped out of a telenovela and has been eye-fucking your husband at every party you've dragged me to?" "That's the one," I confirmed, surprised by how relieved I felt to have someone else acknowledge what I'd been trying to ignore. "And Ryan invited her to stay without discussing it with you first?" I nodded, too emotionally drained to speak. Holly was quiet for a long moment, her lawyer's mind clearly processing the implications. "Natalie," she said gently, "you know what this means, right?" I stared at my hands, unwilling to voice the conclusion I'd been avoiding. "Say it," I whispered. "Your husband is having an affair, and he's moved his mistress into your home. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Holly's words hung in the air between us like a death sentence. I wanted to deny it, to find some rational explanation for Carmen's presence in my home that didn't involve my husband's betrayal. But the evidence was mounting like storm clouds on a clear horizon, impossible to ignore. "I need proof," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "I can't just accuse him based on suspicion and a tube of mascara." Holly leaned forward, her dark eyes sharp with professional focus. "What kind of proof are you looking for, Nat? A signed confession? Photos of them in bed?" Sometimes the obvious answer is the right one. Before I could respond, my phone rang. Ryan's name flashed on the screen, and my heart performed an uncomfortable gymnastics routine in my chest. I stared at the device, paralyzed by indecision. "Answer it," Holly urged. "Act normal. See what he says." I accepted the call with trembling fingers. "Hi, honey," I managed, proud of how steady my voice sounded. "Hey, babe." Ryan's voice carried that casual warmth that had attracted me to him years ago. "Just wanted to check in, make sure everything's going smoothly with Carmen there. I know it's sudden, but I really appreciate you being so cool about it." The word cool made me want to scream. Nothing about this situation was cool, and the fact that he'd expected me to simply accept it without question revealed how little he understood me anymore, or how little he cared about my feelings. "It's fine," I lied. "She seems to be making herself comfortable." "Great, that's great." Ryan's relief was audible. I knew you two would get along. Carmen's really easy to live with, very considerate about personal space and boundaries. The irony of his words nearly choked me. Carmen, who was wearing my clothes and using my bathroom, was considerate about boundaries. I caught Holly's eye, and she made a subtle gesture urging me to continue the conversation. How long did you say she'd be staying? I asked, fishing for information. There was a slight pause before Ryan answered. Well, that's actually why I'm calling. Her renovation is taking longer than expected. Some permit issues, you know how contractors can be. It might be closer to 2 months instead of a few weeks. 2 months. Carmen would be living in my house for 2 months, and Ryan had made this decision without consulting me. The casual way he delivered this information, as if my opinion was irrelevant, sparked something dangerous in my chest. 2 months is quite a while, I said carefully. Don't you think we should have discussed this together? Another pause. Longer this time. Look, Nat, I know it's not ideal, but Carmen was really in a bind. Her husband's traveling constantly, she's got nowhere else to go, and honestly, it'll be nice for you to have some company in that big house. You're always saying how quiet it gets when I'm working late. The manipulation in his words was breathtaking. He was reframing his betrayal as a favor to me, suggesting that I should be grateful for the company of his mistress. My free hand clenched into a fist so tight that my nails bit into my palm. You're right, I said, forcing sweetness into my voice. It will be nice to have someone around. Carmen seems lovely. She really is, Ryan said, and there was something in his tone that made my stomach lurch. She's got this warmth about her, you know? Very nurturing, very understanding about the demands of business. He was describing qualities he used to say he loved about me. Warmth. Understanding. The ability to support his ambitions without complaint. Now he was attributing those same qualities to another woman, the woman who was sleeping in my guest room and drinking from my favorite mug. I should let you get back to work, I said, not trusting myself to continue the conversation without saying something revealing. Love you, babe. Thanks for being so amazing about this. Love you too, I replied automatically, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. After ending the call, I sat in stunned silence while Holly watched me with the intense focus of a predator studying prey. Her expression told me she'd heard enough of the conversation to draw her own conclusions. He's gaslighting you, Holly said bluntly, making you feel like you should be grateful for the privilege of housing his affair partner. That's emotional manipulation, Nat, and it's despicable. I know, I whispered, finally allowing myself to acknowledge the truth I'd been avoiding. God, Holly, I know, but what am I supposed to do? Storm into the house and start throwing accusations around? Kick Carmen out based on suspicion? You gather evidence, Holly said firmly. You document everything. You protect yourself legally and financially before you make any moves. And most importantly, you don't let them know you're onto them. She pulled out her phone and started typing rapidly. I'm canceling my morning appointments. We're going shopping. Shopping? I stared at her in confusion. Holly, I don't think retail therapy is going to solve this problem. Not that kind of shopping, she said with a grim smile. We're going to buy you some surveillance equipment. If Ryan wants to play house with his mistress under your roof, he's going to do it on camera. The idea of spying on my own husband in my own home should have felt wrong, but instead it felt like taking back control. For weeks, maybe months, Ryan and Carmen had been operating in secret, making plans and decisions that affected my life without my knowledge. It was time to level the playing field. An hour later, we were in a nondescript electronics store in Tempe, surrounded by gadgets I'd never imagined needing. The clerk, a young man with thick glasses and the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loved his job, explained the various options for discreet surveillance. These wireless cameras are motion-activated, he said, holding up devices no larger than matchboxes. Battery life is about 2 weeks, and they record in high definition with audio. The footage uploads automatically to a secure cloud server, so even if someone finds the camera, the evidence is already preserved. Holly examined one of the tiny devices with professional interest. How discreet are we talking? They're designed to look like everyday objects, the clerk explained, gesturing to a display case. Smoke detectors, phone chargers, picture frames, even fake plants. Most people never notice them because they blend into the environment. I selected several cameras disguised as common household items, trying not to think about how surreal this situation had become. 6 months ago, I had been planning a surprise party for Ryan's 35th birthday. Now I was buying surveillance equipment to catch him cheating. The installation process was surprisingly simple. Holly and I returned to my house during what I knew would be Carmen's workout time at the gym, based on the schedule she'd cheerfully shared that morning. We placed cameras in strategic locations throughout the house, areas where intimate conversations or activities were likely to occur. The living room camera went inside a decorative candle that sat on the mantelpiece, perfectly positioned to capture the sofa where Ryan and I used to watch movies. The kitchen camera was disguised as a coffee maker accessory, small enough to sit unnoticed among the other appliances on the counter. The most important camera went in a fake succulent plant that I placed on the hallway table outside the guest room where Carmen was supposedly staying. As we worked, Holly kept up a steady stream of legal advice. Document everything, she said for the third time. Times, dates, conversations, anything that seems relevant. Arizona is a no-fault divorce state, but evidence of adultery can still affect property division and spousal support, especially if marital assets are being used to support the affair. The clinical way she discussed the end of my marriage was both comforting and terrifying. Holly's professional demeanor helped me focus on practical concerns, rather than the emotional devastation that threatened to overwhelm me whenever I stopped moving. What about confrontation? I asked as we tested the camera feeds on my phone. When do I tell them I know? Not yet, Holly said firmly. Right now, they think they're in control of the situation. They're comfortable, maybe even getting careless. Give them rope to hang themselves with. The more evidence we gather, the stronger your position becomes. We finished the installation just as I heard Carmen's car in the driveway. Holly slipped out the back door while I arranged myself in the living room with my laptop, pretending to work on a client presentation. When Carmen entered, she was glowing with post-workout endorphins, her cheeks flushed, and her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail that somehow looked effortlessly chic. Great workout, she announced, toweling sweat from her neck. That gym you recommended is amazing. The personal trainers there really know their stuff. I hadn't recommended any gym to Carmen, but I smiled and nodded as if I remembered the conversation. Glad you're settling in, I said. Your home is just so peaceful, Carmen continued, settling onto the sofa directly in front of the hidden camera. I feel more relaxed here than I have in months. Ryan was right when he said this place has good energy. The casual way she mentioned Ryan's opinions about our home made my skin crawl. How long had they been discussing my house, my life, my marriage? How long had I been the unwitting subject of their private conversations? He's always been proud of what we've built here, I said carefully, watching Carmen's reaction. Her smile flickered slightly, a micro-expression that might have been guilt or satisfaction. It's obvious how much love went into creating this space, she said. You can feel it in every room. Ryan's told me so much about your design process, how thoughtful you are about every detail. The idea of Ryan sharing intimate details about our home and my work with his mistress felt like another violation. These weren't just casual conversations between colleagues. He was giving Carmen insights into our private life, our creative collaborations, the dreams we'd built together. I'm glad he appreciates it, I managed, though my throat felt tight with suppressed emotion. Carmen studied me with those dark eyes that had looked so friendly this morning but now seemed calculating. You know, Natalie, I hope my being here doesn't create any awkwardness. The last thing I want is to impose on your marriage or make you uncomfortable in your own home. The false concern in her voice was masterful. She was performing the role of the grateful guest while subtly probing for signs that I suspected the truth. If I were truly naive about their relationship, I would reassure her, dismiss her concerns, make her feel welcome. Not at all, I lied smoothly. Ryan and I have always been good at sharing our space with friends. We're both social people who enjoy having company. Carmen's relief was visible, though she tried to hide it. That's wonderful to hear. Some couples are so territorial about their homes, but you two are clearly secure enough in your relationship to be generous with others. The word territorial hit me like a physical blow. She was suggesting that any discomfort I might feel about her presence would be a sign of insecurity rather than a rational response to invasion. It was another layer of manipulation, designed to make me doubt my own instincts. My phone buzzed with a text message, providing a welcome distraction from Carmen's psychological warfare. The message was from Ryan, but it wasn't addressed to me. Miss you already. Can't wait to get home to you tonight. I stared at the screen in confusion until I realized what had happened. Ryan had sent the message to the wrong contact. He'd meant to text Carmen, who was sitting 3 feet away from me, but had accidentally sent it to his wife instead. The irony was so perfect it almost made me laugh. Here was the proof I'd been looking for, delivered by Ryan's own carelessness. But I couldn't react, couldn't give any sign that I'd received a message meant for another woman. "Everything okay?" Carmen asked, noticing my expression. "Just a client being demanding," I said, quickly closing the message. "You know how it is." Carmen nodded sympathetically, but I caught her glancing at her own phone with a puzzled expression. She was waiting for a message that would never arrive, at least not to her device. I excused myself to the kitchen, ostensibly to get water, but really to process what had just happened. Ryan's accidental message was damning evidence, but it also revealed how comfortable he'd become with his deception. He was no longer being careful about hiding his communications, no longer worried about getting caught. That evening, I watched the surveillance footage from my office, while Ryan and Carmen shared dinner downstairs. The audio quality was excellent, capturing every word of their intimate conversation. "David called today," Carmen was saying, referring to her husband. "He's extending his trip in Denver another week. Some complications with the audit." "That's good news for us," Ryan replied, and I could hear the smile in his voice. More time together without having to sneak around. "I feel guilty sometimes," Carmen admitted. "About David, about Natalie. They don't deserve this." Ryan's response chilled me to the bone. "Natalie and I have been growing apart for years. She's so focused on her business, so independent. Sometimes I feel like I'm married to a roommate rather than a wife. And David travels so much, he barely knows you exist. We're not destroying happy marriages here, Carmen. We're just finding happiness where we can." The casual dismissal of our 8-year marriage was breathtaking. According to Ryan, I was a neglectful wife who had driven him into another woman's arms. My independence, which he'd once claimed to admire, was now evidence of my failure as a spouse. But it was Carmen's next words that truly shattered my remaining illusions about their relationship. "When are you going to tell her about us?" "About the baby?" "Baby." The word hit me like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. Carmen was pregnant with Ryan's child. This wasn't just an affair, it was the complete destruction of everything I'd believed about my life and future. "Soon," Ryan said softly. "After the Henderson project closes, when I don't need her signature on any more business documents. Once the finances are sorted, I'll tell her I want a divorce." They had it all planned out. My husband and his pregnant mistress were discussing the end of my marriage like a business transaction, calculating the optimal timing for maximum benefit to themselves. I was an obstacle to be managed, a problem to be solved efficiently, and with minimal disruption to their plans. I sat in my office chair, staring at the laptop screen, feeling something fundamental shift inside me. The woman who had walked into our kitchen that morning and found Carmen making coffee was gone, replaced by someone harder, angrier, and infinitely more dangerous. Ryan thought he was married to a roommate. Carmen thought she was dealing with a naive wife who could be manipulated and discarded. They had both underestimated me completely, and that was going to be their downfall. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. David Rodriguez answered on the second ring, his voice tired but professional. "Hello, David," I said, surprised by how calm I sounded. "This is Natalie Parker, Ryan's wife. I think we need to talk." David Rodriguez sounded genuinely puzzled when he answered my call. "Mrs. Parker? Is everything all right? Has something happened to Carmen?" The concern in his voice made what I was about to do even more difficult, but also more necessary. David deserved to know the truth about his wife, just as I deserved to know the truth about my husband. "No, David, Carmen is fine, but I think you and I need to have a conversation about what's been happening while you've been traveling." There was a long pause before he responded. I'm not sure I understand. Carmen told me she was staying with friends during the condo renovation. Are you saying there's a problem with the arrangement? I chose my words carefully, knowing that once I spoke them, there would be no taking them back. David, Carmen isn't staying with friends. She's been living in my house for the past week, and I have reason to believe she and my husband are having an affair. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear David's breathing change, becoming shallower and more rapid. When he finally spoke, his voice was strained. That's a very serious accusation, Mrs. Parker. Are you certain about this? I understand how shocking this must be, I said gently, but I have evidence. Audio recordings, photographs, documentation of their relationship. I think you should come home from Denver as soon as possible. Evidence? David's voice cracked slightly. What kind of evidence? I took a deep breath before continuing. They've been recorded discussing their relationship, their plans for the future, and Carmen's pregnancy. The phone went completely silent for so long that I wondered if the call had dropped. Then I heard what sounded like a sharp intake of breath, followed by a strangled sound that might have been a sob or a curse. Pregnancy? He whispered. Carmen's pregnant? According to the conversations I've recorded, yes. And the baby isn't yours, David. Another long silence, punctuated by what sounded like David sitting down heavily in a chair. How long? He asked finally. How long has this been going on? I don't know exactly, but based on what I've observed and overheard, I'd estimate several months at minimum. They're very comfortable with each other, very familiar. This isn't a recent development. David's breathing was audible through the phone, ragged and uncontrolled. I felt terrible for being the bearer of such devastating news, but he had a right to know what his wife was doing while he worked 70-hour weeks to support their lifestyle. I need to see this evidence, he said finally, his voice steadier now but cold in a way that hadn't been there before. Can you send me what you have? I can do better than that, I offered. Why don't you come to Phoenix? Stay in a hotel near my house, and I'll show you everything in person. That way you can see for yourself what's been happening, when. The single word carried a weight of pain and determination. How quickly can you get here? I can catch a red-eye flight tonight, be there by morning. Text me your address, and I'll let you know when I land. After ending the call, I sat in my office, feeling the weight of what I'd just set in motion. David Rodriguez was flying across the country to confront evidence of his wife's betrayal, and I was the architect of his upcoming devastation. But as I looked at the surveillance footage still playing on my laptop screen, showing Ryan and Carmen cuddled together on my sofa like devoted lovers, I reminded myself that I wasn't creating this situation. I was simply revealing it. The next morning brought an unexpected development. I woke early, as had become my habit since Carmen's arrival, and made my way downstairs to find her seated at my kitchen island with tears streaming down her face. She was staring at her phone with an expression of pure anguish, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Is everything okay? I asked, playing the role of the concerned hostess. Carmen looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. It's David, she said, her voice thick with emotion. He's coming home unexpectedly. Some emergency with his family that he won't explain over the phone. He'll be here this afternoon. I feigned surprise, while mentally calculating timing. David's flight was scheduled to land in 3 hours, which meant he'd arrive at the house right around the time Ryan usually got home from work. Perfect synchronization for maximum impact. That's sudden, I said, pouring myself coffee with studied casualness. Is his family okay? Carmen shook her head, wiping her eyes with one of my expensive paper towels. He wouldn't say. Just that he needed to come home immediately, and that we needed to talk. He sounded so cold, Natalie. I've never heard him speak to me like that before. The genuine fear in her voice almost made me feel guilty. Almost. Carmen had made her choices, and now she was going to face the consequences. The fact that she was finally experiencing some of the anxiety and uncertainty she'd inflicted on me was poetic justice. I'm sure it's nothing serious, I lied smoothly. David's probably just stressed from work. You know how demanding his job can be." Carmen nodded, but she didn't look convinced. She spent the rest of the morning in a state of nervous agitation, pacing around my house and checking her phone obsessively. When Ryan called during his lunch break, she practically threw herself at the phone. "David's coming home," she told him without preamble. "This afternoon. He says there's a family emergency, but he won't tell me what it is." I could hear Ryan's voice through the phone, though I couldn't make out his words. Whatever he was saying wasn't reassuring Carmen, because her expression grew more panicked with each passing second. "What if he knows?" she whispered. "What if someone told him about us?" Ryan's response was apparently confident and dismissive, because Carmen's shoulders relaxed slightly. "You're right," she said. "I'm probably overreacting. It's just such terrible timing with the pregnancy and everything." They spoke for a few more minutes, their conversation a masterclass in guilty paranoia. Every coincidence seemed suspicious. Every unexpected change in routine felt like a potential threat to their secret. It would have been entertaining if it weren't so personally devastating. After Carmen ended the call, she turned to me with forced brightness. "Looks like David will be joining us for dinner tonight after all. I hope you don't mind the extra company." "Not at all," I replied, though internally I was calculating how to orchestrate the confrontation for maximum effect. It'll be nice to finally meet him properly. The afternoon crawled by with excruciating slowness. Carmen alternated between frantic cleaning, presumably trying to eliminate any evidence of her extended stay, and nervous phone calls to her gynecologist's office, rescheduling an appointment she'd planned for the following week. I observed all of this with the detached fascination of an anthropologist studying a foreign culture. At 4:00, my phone buzzed with a text from David. "Just landed. Heading to hotel to check in, then coming to your address. Are you ready for this?" I responded quickly. "As ready as I'll ever be. Carmen is expecting you for dinner. She thinks it's a surprise visit due to a family emergency." "Good," came his reply. "The element of surprise will work in our favor." Ryan arrived home at his usual time, completely unaware that his world was about to implode. He greeted Carmen with a casual kiss that I observed from the kitchen doorway, noting how natural and practiced the gesture appeared. These weren't the furtive embraces of new lovers. This was the comfortable intimacy of an established couple. "How was your day?" Ryan asked, loosening his tie in a gesture I'd seen thousands of times during our marriage. "Stressful," Carmen admitted. "David's flying in tonight. Some emergency he won't explain." Ryan's expression shifted subtly, the easy confidence replaced by something sharper and more alert. "Did he say anything specific about what kind of emergency? Just that it was family-related and that we needed to talk." Carmen's voice was small and worried. "Ryan, what if someone saw us together? What if he's suspicious?" Ryan pulled her into his arms, a gesture that felt like a knife to my chest. "Hey," he murmured against her hair. "We've been careful. There's no way he could know anything. You're probably reading too much into it." I watched this tender moment between my husband and his pregnant mistress from my hiding spot, recording every word with the phone in my pocket. The casual cruelty of their betrayal was breathtaking. They were comforting each other about the possibility of being caught, never once considering the impact their affair was having on the innocent parties involved. The doorbell rang at precisely 6:00, and I watched Carmen's face go pale with terror. She looked to Ryan for reassurance, but he was already moving toward the guest room, presumably to hide any evidence of his presence. "I'll get it," I announced cheerfully, walking toward the front door while Carmen smoothed her hair and tried to compose herself. David Rodriguez stood on my doorstep looking every inch the successful corporate executive he was. Tall and lean with salt and pepper hair and intelligent brown eyes, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions. But I could see the tension in his shoulders, the tight line of his mouth that suggested he was holding his emotions in check through sheer force of will. "Mrs. Parker," he said formally, extending his hand. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." "Please, call me Natalie," I replied, shaking his hand and noting the firm grip. Come in. Carmen's in the living room waiting for you." As we walked through my foyer, David's eyes swept over the elegant interior with the appraising gaze of someone who understood quality and expense. "This is a beautiful home," he said quietly. "Carmen's told me so much about it." The irony of his comment wasn't lost on me. Carmen had indeed told him about my home, but probably not that she'd been living in it as my husband's mistress. "Has she?" I murmured. "How interesting." We entered the living room to find Carmen perched on the edge of the sofa, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. When she saw David, she jumped up with forced enthusiasm, but I noticed she didn't move to embrace him. "David," she said breathlessly, "you made such good time." "How was your flight?" "Informative," David replied, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp as they studied his wife. "We need to talk, Carmen." "Privately." Carmen's gaze darted nervously between David and me. "Of course. But maybe we should go back to the condo first. Get you settled in after your trip." "The condo," David repeated slowly. "Yes, let's definitely discuss the condo. And your renovation project. And where exactly you've been staying during this extensive construction work." The color drained from Carmen's face completely. I could see her mind racing, trying to calculate how much David knew and how much she could safely deny. "David, I can explain." "I'm sure you can," he said coldly. "But first, I'd like to understand something. You told me you were staying with friends during the renovation. Would you consider Mrs. Parker's husband a friend?" The question hung in the air like a sword about to fall. Carmen's mouth opened and closed without producing sound, while I stood frozen in the doorway, watching the confrontation unfold. That's when Ryan chose to make his appearance, emerging from the guest room with his shirt buttoned incorrectly, and his hair mussed in a way that left no doubt about what he'd been doing. He stopped short when he saw David, his face cycling through surprise, guilt, and finally, resignation. David looked between Ryan and Carmen, taking in Ryan's disheveled appearance and Carmen's terrified expression. When he spoke, his voice was deadly quiet. "Well, this is awkward." The silence that followed was deafening. 4 adults standing in my elegant living room, the careful facades we'd all maintained finally crumbling under the weight of truth. Carmen was crying openly now, tears streaming down her face as she stared at her husband with an expression of desperate pleading. Ryan, to his credit, didn't try to lie or make excuses. He straightened his shoulders and met David's gaze directly. "David," he said simply, "we need to talk." "Yes," David agreed, his composure holding, but barely. "I think we do. All of us." I moved to the wet bar and poured 4 glasses of whiskey, noting with dark amusement that my hands were perfectly steady. When I distributed the drinks, David accepted his with a nod of thanks, while Carmen pushed hers away untouched. "How long?" David asked, directing the question to both Ryan and Carmen. Carmen looked to Ryan for guidance, but he was staring into his whiskey glass as if it contained the answers to life's mysteries. 6 months, she whispered finally. "Maybe 7. David absorbed this information with the stoic expression of someone accustomed to processing bad news. "And the pregnancy?" Carmen's sob was audible throughout the room. 3 months, she managed between tears. "So the baby isn't mine," David said matter-of-factly. "It's his." Ryan finally looked up from his drink. "David, I want you to know that neither of us planned for this to happen. It just developed naturally over time." The casual tone of Ryan's explanation clearly infuriated David, whose controlled facade finally cracked. "Naturally?" he repeated, his voice rising. "You mean naturally like a disease? Naturally like decay? Because that's what this is, Ryan. The natural decomposition of everything decent about both of your characters." Carmen flinched as if she'd been slapped. "David, please, let me explain how this started." "I know exactly how it started," David said, his voice dropping back to that dangerous quiet. "It started with lies. Lies about where you were going, who you were seeing, what you were doing. It started with you deciding that your marriage vows meant less than your immediate gratification." He turned to Ryan with laser focus. "And you. You invited my wife to live in your home while carrying on an affair with her, Do you have any idea how sick that is? How completely depraved? Ryan had the grace to look ashamed, but he didn't back down. I love her, David. I know that doesn't excuse what we've done, but I genuinely love Carmen, and she loves me. Love, David repeated mockingly. You love her so much that you let her lie to her husband for months while you played house together. That's not love, Ryan. That's selfishness dressed up in romantic language. I watched this confrontation with fascination, noting how each man's true character was being revealed under pressure. David's pain was transforming into righteous anger, while Ryan's guilt was making him defensive and self-justifying. What happens now? Carmen asked through her tears. Where do we go from here? David looked at his wife with an expression I couldn't quite read. A mixture of love, disappointment, and something that might have been pity. That depends, Carmen. Do you want to save our marriage, or are you committed to this fantasy you've been living? Carmen's gaze moved between the two men in her life, and I could see the exact moment when she made her choice. She moved closer to Ryan, taking his hand in hers. I'm sorry, David. I truly am. But I can't pretend anymore. I love Ryan, and I want to be with him. David nodded slowly, as if he'd expected this response. Then I guess that makes things simple. You can have him, Carmen, and he can have all the responsibilities that come with you. He set down his untouched whiskey and looked directly at me for the first time since the confrontation began. Natalie, I owe you an apology. Not just for my wife's behavior, but for not figuring this out sooner. If I'd been paying attention, maybe we could have prevented some of this pain. The kindness in his voice nearly broke my composure. You have nothing to apologize for, David. We were both deceived by people we trusted. David stood to leave, and Carmen reached for his arm. David, wait, can't we talk about this? Work something out? He looked down at her hand on his sleeve, then gently removed it. There's nothing to work out, Carmen. You made your choice. Now you get to live with the consequences. After David left, the three of us sat in uncomfortable silence. Ryan and Carmen were still holding hands, but the triumphant reunion they'd probably imagined was overshadowed by the reality of what they'd lost in pursuit of their happiness. I guess this means our marriage is over, Ryan said finally, looking at me with something that might have been regret. I smiled at him, feeling strangely peaceful for the first time in weeks. Our marriage has been over for months, Ryan. Tonight was just the official announcement. What happens next? Carmen asked, her voice small and uncertain. Next, I said, standing up and smoothing my skirt, you two get to figure out how to build a life together based on deception and betrayal. Good luck with that. As I walked toward the stairs, I heard Ryan call my name. I turned back to find him watching me with an expression I couldn't interpret. For what it's worth, Nat, I really am sorry about how this all played out. I considered his apology for a moment before responding. No, Ryan, you're not sorry about how it played out. You're sorry you got caught. There's a difference. I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, leaving my husband and his pregnant mistress to contemplate their uncertain future in the ruins of the life we'd built together. Tomorrow I would start planning my own future. But tonight I was finally ready to sleep peacefully in my own bed. The morning after the confrontation brought an eerie silence to my house. Your family's petition to exclude you from the inheritance was actually the final piece of evidence we needed to prove that Linda Chen was actively trying to control assets she knew contained criminal proceeds. By fighting to keep you away from the estate, she essentially confessed to knowing there was something in the estate worth hiding. The irony was perfect. My family's attempt to punish me for exposing criminal activity had ultimately provided the evidence needed to expose even more criminal activity. As Agent Thompson walked away to coordinate the transport of her prisoners, Emma approached me hesitantly. Her eyes were red from crying, but her expression was clearer than I'd seen it in years. Rebecca, she said quietly, I owe you an apology. I've spent 8 years thinking you abandoned us, when really you were trying to save us from ourselves. I hugged my sister for the first time in nearly a decade, feeling 8 years of tension and misunderstanding begin to dissolve. Emma, you don't owe me anything. I made choices that hurt our family, even if they were the right choices. I should have found a way to explain, To help you understand. She shook her head. No, you did what you had to do. And grandmother was right. You were the only one strong enough to do it. As we stood in the empty courtroom, surrounded by the detritus of a family's complete transformation, I realized that this hearing had accomplished something I'd never expected. It hadn't just resolved an inheritance dispute. It had finally, after 8 years, allowed me to tell the truth about why I'd made the choices I'd made. More importantly, it had revealed that my grandmother had understood those choices all along. She had seen what I couldn't see at the time, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for a family is refuse to enable their destruction. The medal in my folder, the one that had started this entire revelation, represented more than recognition for a job well done. It represented the moment I'd chosen justice over comfort, truth over loyalty, and right over easy. As Emma and I walked out of the courthouse together, I realized that my grandmother's real gift to me hadn't been the house or the money or the investments. Her real gift had been the knowledge that she understood, that she approved, and that she trusted me to continue making the hard choices that would protect what was worth protecting and expose what needed to be exposed. The kitchen, where she'd made herself at home in my designer robe. The guest room where they'd carried on their affair while I slept upstairs, oblivious to the betrayal happening under my own roof. Each room held memories of the life Ryan and I had built together, but now those memories felt contaminated by the knowledge of his deception. The dining room where we'd hosted dinner parties for his business associates, several of whom had probably known about his affair before I did. The home theater, where we'd spent countless evenings watching movies. His phone buzzing with secret messages from Carmen while I believed we were having quality time together. My reflection was interrupted by the doorbell. Through the front window, I could see a delivery truck parked in my driveway, and a uniformed man stood on my doorstep holding an enormous bouquet of white roses. I accepted the delivery with confusion, wondering who would be sending me flowers at such a strange time. The card attached to the arrangement bore a simple message in elegant handwriting. Thank you for your courage in telling me the truth. You saved me from living a lie. With gratitude and respect, David Rodriguez. The gesture was unexpectedly touching. In the midst of his own personal catastrophe, David had taken time to acknowledge what I'd done, to recognize that exposing the affair had required its own form of bravery. I arranged the roses in a crystal vase, their pristine white petals a stark contrast to the emotional chaos surrounding me. The day passed quietly, punctuated by occasional text messages from Ryan, requesting access to various belongings he'd left behind. His communications were businesslike and distant, as if our 8-year marriage had been reduced to a series of logistical problems to be solved efficiently. Can I pick up my golf clubs this afternoon? Need to get some clothes from the closet. Will Carmen be there? Found a realtor to discuss selling the house. When can we meet? Each message felt like another small betrayal, evidence of how quickly Ryan was moving to dismantle our shared life. The house that had been our dream home, the space where we'd planned to raise children and grow old together, was now just another asset to be liquidated. I responded to his requests with equal formality, granting permission for retrievals and scheduling meetings while carefully maintaining emotional distance. If Ryan wanted to treat our divorce like a business transaction, I could certainly accommodate that approach. That evening brought an unexpected visitor. I was reviewing client proposals in my home office when I heard a car in the driveway, followed by hesitant knocking at my front door. Through the peephole, I saw Carmen standing on my doorstep alone, her usual confidence replaced by nervous uncertainty. Opening the door felt like a mistake, but curiosity got the better of my judgment. Carmen looked terrible, her perfectly styled hair disheveled and her designer clothes wrinkled as if she'd slept in them. The confident woman who'd made herself at home in my kitchen just days earlier was gone, replaced by someone who looked fragile and defeated. Natalie, she said softly, her voice hoarse from crying. Can we talk? Please. Against my better judgment, I stepped aside to let her enter. We sat in my living room, the same space where her husband had confronted her less than 24 hours earlier, and I waited for her to explain her presence. I know you have every right to hate me, Carmen began, twisting her wedding ring around her finger in a nervous gesture. What I did was unforgivable. The way I violated your home, your marriage, your trust. I don't have any excuse that makes it okay. You're right, I agreed simply. You don't. Carmen flinched at my bluntness but continued. I wanted you to know that I never intended for things to go this far. When Ryan first invited me to dinner after that conference in Vegas, I thought it was just colleagues being friendly. One thing led to another, and before I knew it, we were in too deep to stop. The conference in Vegas. Another detail Ryan had never mentioned. Another business trip that had apparently included activities beyond work presentations. I filed this information away with the growing catalog of my husband's deceptions. When did you know you were pregnant? I asked, curious despite myself. 6 weeks ago, Carmen admitted. That's when everything became real, you know? When I realized this wasn't just an affair anymore, it was going to change everything permanently. And you decided to move into my house anyway, I observed, knowing you were carrying my husband's child. Carmen's composure cracked completely at that observation. I know how horrible that sounds, she sobbed. But I was scared, Natalie. David's been traveling constantly. I couldn't stay in our condo with all the construction noise, and Ryan said you wouldn't mind having company. I convinced myself it was temporary, that nobody would get hurt if we were just discreet. The self-deception in her explanation was breathtaking. Carmen had genuinely believed that carrying on an affair in my home while pregnant with my husband's child was acceptable, as long as she was polite about it. The cognitive dissonance required for such thinking was almost impressive. What do you want from me, Carmen? I asked wearily. Forgiveness? Understanding? Permission to steal my husband without feeling guilty about it? I want you to know that I understand what I've cost you, she said quietly. Your marriage, your security, your ability to trust people. I want you to know that I'm not some heartless homewrecker who enjoyed destroying your life. I'm just someone who made terrible choices and lost control of the situation. Her words carried the ring of genuine remorse, but they didn't change anything fundamental about what she'd done. Regret after the fact didn't undo months of calculated deception and betrayal. Are you and Ryan planning to stay together? I asked, genuinely curious about their future. Carmen's expression grew uncertain. We're trying to figure that out. Everything happened so fast last night, with David arriving and the confrontation. We haven't had time to really discuss what comes next. The uncertainty in her voice suggested that Ryan's commitment to their relationship might be wavering now that it was no longer a thrilling secret but a messy public reality. Affairs often thrived on secrecy and drama, but functioning relationships required different skills entirely. David filed for divorce this morning, Carmen continued. His lawyer called me at the hotel. He's not asking for anything from me, just wants a clean break. He said he can't be married to someone he doesn't trust. The pain in her voice was genuine, and I found myself feeling an unexpected stab of sympathy for her. Despite everything she'd done to me, Carmen was losing her marriage too, along with the financial security and social status that came with being David's wife. I'm sorry about your marriage, I said, and meant it. David seems like a good man who deserved better. He is, Carmen agreed, fresh tears flowing. He's been nothing but kind and supportive throughout our entire relationship. He worked those crazy hours partly to give me the lifestyle I wanted, and I repaid him by having an affair and getting pregnant by another man. The self-awareness in her confession was striking. Carmen understood exactly what she'd thrown away and why, which somehow made her choices even more tragic. What about your job? I asked. Will you be able to support yourself and the baby? Carmen's face went pale at the question. I haven't thought that far ahead yet. Ryan says he'll help financially, but his own finances are complicated with the divorce and business obligations. I might have to move back in with my parents until I figure things out. The practical reality of her situation was clearly beginning to sink in. Carmen had traded a stable marriage to a successful man for an uncertain future, with someone whose own life was about to be upended by divorce proceedings. The romantic fantasy was giving way to harsh economic realities. We sat in uncomfortable silence for several minutes. Two women whose lives had been irrevocably changed by the choices made by the people we'd trusted most. Despite everything Carmen had done to me, I couldn't help but recognize that we were both casualties of the same deception. I should go, Carmen said finally, standing up with obvious reluctance. Ryan's waiting in the car. He didn't want to come in, said it would be too awkward. Probably wise, I agreed, walking her to the door. At the threshold, Carmen turned back to face me one final time. Natalie, I know this doesn't mean anything now, but I want you to know that I admire you. The way you handled this whole situation with such dignity and strength. I don't think I could have been as composed if the roles were reversed. The compliment felt strange coming from the woman who'd helped destroy my marriage, but I sensed it was sincere. Thank you, I said simply. After Carmen left, I stood in my doorway watching as she walked to Ryan's BMW parked at the curb. He was sitting in the driver's seat, staring straight ahead rather than looking at the house where he'd lived for 5 years. When Carmen got in the car, they had what appeared to be a brief, tense conversation before driving away. The interaction left me feeling drained but oddly relieved. Seeing Carmen broken and uncertain had somehow helped me process my own feelings about the affair. She wasn't the confident seductress I'd imagined, just a flawed person who'd made catastrophic choices and was now dealing with the consequences. The next few days passed in a blur of legal meetings, financial reviews, and difficult conversations about dividing the assets Ryan and I had accumulated during our marriage. Holly proved invaluable during this process, her sharp legal mind cutting through the emotional complexity to focus on practical outcomes. The forensic accountant she'd recommended, a meticulous woman named Patricia Chen, uncovered several concerning irregularities in Ryan's business finances. Loans taken against company assets without proper documentation, client deposits moved between accounts in ways that violated industry regulations, and a pattern of financial decisions that suggested Ryan had been preparing for divorce long before I'd suspected anything. He's been systematically moving assets out of your reach for at least 6 months, Patricia explained during our meeting at Holly's law office. The timing coincides with when his affair with Carmen Rodriguez likely began. This suggests premeditation rather than spontaneous decision-making. The calculated nature of Ryan's deception was breathtaking. While I'd been trusting him with our shared finances, he'd been methodically protecting his interests and limiting my access to marital assets. The man I'd thought I knew, someone capable of such elaborate long-term deception, was essentially a stranger. Holly leaned forward across her conference table, her expression grim. This changes everything, Nat. If we can prove Ryan was hiding assets in anticipation of divorce, it affects how community property gets divided. He can't benefit from his own fraud. The legal implications were complex, but the emotional impact was crystal clear. Ryan hadn't just cheated on me sexually, he'd cheated me financially as well. Every signature I'd provided on business documents, every joint decision about investments and expenditures, had been made under false pretenses. What's our next step? I asked, feeling oddly detached from the discussion of my own financial future. We file for divorce citing adultery and financial fraud, Holly said decisively. We demand full disclosure of all assets, including any accounts or investments he might have hidden, and we make sure you get every penny you're entitled to, under Arizona community property law. The prospect of a contentious divorce battle was exhausting, but I knew Holly was right. Ryan had chosen to make our separation adversarial by hiding assets and lying about his intentions. I couldn't afford to be naive about protecting my interests just because I'd once loved him. That evening, I received a phone call that surprised me. David Rodriguez's name appeared on my caller ID, and I answered with curiosity about why he might be contacting me. Natalie, David said, his voice warmer than I'd expected. I hope I'm not intruding, but I wanted to thank you again for the courage you showed in telling me about Carmen's affair. I know it couldn't have been easy. It was the right thing to do, I replied simply. You deserve to know the truth. I've been thinking about our conversation the other night, David continued, about how both of us were deceived by people we trusted. I was wondering if you might be interested in having dinner sometime. Not a date, he added quickly. Just two people who understand what the other is going through, sharing a meal and maybe some perspective. The invitation was unexpected, but not unwelcome. David had been nothing but kind and respectful during our brief interactions, and the idea of talking to someone who truly understood the particular pain of spousal betrayal was appealing. I'd like that, I said. When were you thinking? How about tomorrow night? I know a quiet restaurant in Scottsdale where we can talk without worrying about running into mutual acquaintances. We arranged to meet at 7 o'clock at a small Italian place David recommended, and I found myself looking forward to the evening more than I'd anticipated. After days of legal meetings and financial reviews, the prospect of a normal conversation with someone who understood my situation felt like a gift. The next evening, I dressed carefully for dinner, choosing a simple black dress that was elegant but not overly formal. As I applied makeup in my master bathroom mirror, I noticed how different I looked compared to just a week earlier. The stress and revelation of the past few days had changed something fundamental in my expression, replacing naive trust with hard-won wisdom. David was waiting for me at the restaurant when I arrived, looking distinguished in a navy blazer and crisp white shirt. He stood when he saw me approach, pulling out my chair with old-fashioned courtesy that felt refreshing after months of Ryan's increasing indifference. "You look lovely," he said simply, and I could tell he meant it without any ulterior motive. "Thank you," I replied, settling into my seat. "And thank you for suggesting this. I didn't realize how much I needed to talk to someone who understands what I'm going through." The restaurant David had chosen was perfect for intimate conversation, with soft lighting and well-spaced tables that afforded privacy. We ordered wine and settled into the kind of deep discussion that would have been impossible under different circumstances. "How are you handling everything?" David asked after we'd placed our dinner orders. The practical aspects, I mean. Divorce proceedings, financial arrangements, all the logistics of untangling a shared life. "It's overwhelming," I admitted. "I'm discovering that Ryan was hiding assets and preparing for divorce long before I knew anything was wrong. My lawyer says it's going to be a complicated process to recover what I'm entitled to." David's jaw tightened with anger on my behalf. "That's unconscionable. Bad enough that he cheated, but to deliberately sabotage your financial security is beyond cruel." The righteous indignation in his voice was validating in a way I hadn't expected. For weeks, I'd been surrounded by people who knew about Ryan's affair before I did, who'd watched me be deceived without saying anything. David's clear moral stance was refreshing. "What about you?" I asked. "How are you managing the practical aspects of your divorce?" David's expression grew thoughtful. "Honestly, the practical stuff is the easy part. Carmen and I don't have children, we kept our finances mostly separate, and I'm not interested in punitive measures. I just want to move forward with my life." "That's very mature of you," I observed, "especially considering everything Carmen put you through." "Maturity is one way to look at it," David said with a rueful smile. "Self-preservation might be more accurate. I spent too many years of my marriage trying to fix problems that weren't really my responsibility. I'm not going to waste more energy being angry about something I can't change." The wisdom in his approach impressed me. While I was still processing anger and betrayal, David had somehow moved past those emotions to acceptance and forward planning. It gave me hope that I might eventually reach that same place of peace. Our conversation continued throughout dinner, ranging from practical divorce considerations to deeper questions about trust, forgiveness, and starting over in midlife. David was an excellent listener, asking thoughtful questions and offering insights based on his own experience without trying to give advice or fix my problems. I find myself questioning everything now I confided over dessert. Not just my marriage to Ryan, but my judgment in general. How did I miss so many signs? How was I so naive about what was happening in my own house? "You weren't naive," David said firmly. "You were trusting. There's a difference. Carmen and Ryan deliberately deceived us. And they were good at it, because they had practice. You can't blame yourself for not anticipating that level of calculated dishonesty." His words were exactly what I needed to hear. Validation that my blindness to the affair wasn't a character flaw, but a reasonable response to elaborate deception. We'd both been victims of people who'd chosen selfishness over integrity, and neither of us deserved the guilt we were carrying. As we prepared to leave the restaurant, David made another unexpected suggestion. "I know this might sound presumptuous, but I was wondering if you'd be interested in staying in touch. Not romantically," he clarified quickly, "but as friends who understand what the other has been through. I think we could help each other navigate this difficult transition." "I'd like that very much," I replied, and meant it completely. David walked me to my car, and as we said goodnight, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. hope. Not for reconciliation with Ryan or for immediate healing from the betrayal, but for the possibility that this devastating chapter of my life might eventually lead to something better. Driving home through the quiet Scottsdale streets, I reflected on how much had changed in just 1 week. 7 days earlier, I'd been a wife living in denial about her failing marriage. Tonight I was a soon-to-be divorced woman having dinner with a kind man who understood my pain because he'd experienced his own version of the same betrayal. The transformation was painful but also liberating. For the first time since discovering Ryan's affair, I felt like I was moving forward rather than simply reacting to circumstances beyond my control. Tomorrow would bring more meetings with lawyers and accountants, more difficult decisions about dividing assets and rebuilding my life. But tonight, I was no longer the woman who'd found Carmen Rodriguez making coffee in her kitchen. I was someone stronger, wiser, and ultimately more capable of creating the life I actually wanted, rather than the one I thought I was supposed to want. 3 months after the confrontation that shattered my marriage, I stood in my redesigned home office, reviewing contracts for what had become the most successful period in my interior design career. The irony wasn't lost on me that my personal life falling apart had somehow catalyzed unprecedented professional growth. Word had spread through Phoenix's social circles about my grace under pressure during the divorce proceedings, and wealthy women who'd witnessed messy separations in their own circles were drawn to someone who handled crisis with dignity. The morning brought news that would have devastated me months earlier, but now felt like closing a chapter I was ready to finish. Holly called just as I was reviewing sketches for a mansion renovation in Paradise Valley, her voice carrying the satisfaction of a lawyer who'd achieved everything her client deserved. "The settlement agreement is finalized," she announced without preamble. "Ryan signed everything this morning. You're getting the house, 60% of the liquid assets, and half of his business equity, to be paid out over 3 years." The financial victory felt hollow compared to the emotional healing I'd undergone, but I recognized its importance for my future security. What about the hidden accounts Patricia discovered? "All disclosed and included in the settlement," Holly confirmed. Ryan's lawyer advised him that fighting the forensic accounting would cost more than compliance. He also agreed to cover your legal fees, which totals another $40,000 in your favor. I should have felt triumphant, but instead I experienced only relief that the legal battle was finally over. Ryan had fought the settlement initially, presumably hoping I'd accept less to avoid a prolonged court case. He'd underestimated both my resolve and Holly's tenacity in pursuing every asset I was legally entitled to claim. "There's something else," Holly continued, her tone shifting to something more personal. "Ryan's company is in serious financial trouble. The forensic accountant found evidence that he'd been using client deposits to cover operational expenses for months before the affair came to light. There's likely to be criminal charges filed within the next few weeks." This information should have shocked me, but it explained so much about Ryan's increasingly erratic behavior in the months leading up to our separation. The long hours, the stressed phone calls, the desperate edge to his interactions with clients and vendors. He hadn't just been hiding an affair, he'd been concealing the imminent collapse of his business empire. "Does Carmen know?" I asked, genuinely curious about how this development would affect the woman who'd chosen to link her future to Ryan's. "According to my sources, she's been asking a lot of questions about Ryan's finances lately," Holly said with dark amusement. "Apparently the glamorous lifestyle he promised isn't materializing as quickly as she expected." The conversation with Holly left me feeling unexpectedly liberated. For months, I'd been angry about Ryan's betrayal, hurt by his deception, and worried about my financial security. Learning that his entire life was built on fraudulent business practices somehow completed the picture of who he really was. I hadn't lost a good man to another woman, I'd escaped from someone whose moral compass was fundamentally broken. That afternoon brought a visitor I hadn't expected to see again. Carmen Rodriguez stood at my front door looking dramatically different from the confident woman who'd once made herself at home in my kitchen. Her pregnancy was clearly visible now beneath a simple sundress that looked off the rack rather than designer, and her previously immaculate appearance had been replaced by the tired look of someone struggling with both physical and emotional stress. "I know I have no right to be here," she said before I could speak, "but I needed to talk to you about Ryan." Against my better judgment, I invited her in. We sat in the living room where her husband had confronted her months earlier, and I waited for her to explain her presence. "He's lying to me," Carmen said without preamble, her hands resting protectively over her rounded belly. "About everything. The business, the money, his plans for our future. I think he's been lying from the beginning." "What specifically are you talking about?" I asked, though I suspected I knew where this conversation was heading. Carmen pulled out her phone and showed me screenshots of text messages. "The construction company is failing," Ryan had written to someone. "Need to liquidate assets before creditors freeze everything. Can't let C know how bad things really are." "When did you discover these?" I asked, studying the damning evidence of Ryan's continued deception. "Last week," Carmen admitted. His phone was charging in our hotel room, and I saw messages coming in from his lawyer about criminal charges. When I confronted him, he said it was just temporary problems that would resolve themselves once our divorce settlements were finalized. The naivety in her explanation was breathtaking. Carmen had apparently believed that divorcing his wife would somehow solve Ryan's fundamental business problems and legal troubles. She'd traded a stable marriage to a successful man for a relationship with someone whose empire was built on fraud. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "What do you want from me?" Carmen's composure cracked completely at the question. "I want to know if you think he ever really loved me," she sobbed. "Or if I was just a convenient distraction while his life fell apart. Because if I destroyed my marriage for someone who was just using me, I don't know how I'll live with myself." The desperation in her voice was genuine, and I found myself feeling sorry for her despite everything she'd put me through. Carmen had made terrible choices, but she was also clearly another victim of Ryan's manipulation and deception. "I think Ryan loves the idea of you," I said carefully. "The excitement, the validation, the escape from his problems. But I don't think he's capable of the kind of mature love that builds lasting relationships. He certainly wasn't capable of it with me." Carmen absorbed this assessment with visible pain. She'd been hoping for reassurance that her sacrifice had been worthwhile, that her betrayal of David had been justified by genuine love. Instead, she was confronting the possibility that she'd destroyed her life for an illusion. "David's been trying to reach me," she admitted quietly. "Not to reconcile, just to check on the baby. He says he still cares about my well-being, even though he can't forgive what I did." The kindness David was showing his ex-wife, even after her betrayal, was completely consistent with the character I'd come to know through our friendship. He was a fundamentally decent person who separated his personal pain from his concern for others. "You should talk to him," I advised. "Not about getting back together, but about practical support. You're going to need help raising this baby, especially if Ryan's facing criminal charges." Carmen nodded through her tears, but I could see the resistance in her expression. Accepting help from the husband she'd betrayed would require admitting that leaving him had been a catastrophic mistake. After Carmen left, I found myself reflecting on the strange turns my life had taken since that morning when I'd found her in my kitchen. The woman who'd invaded my home and stolen my husband was now seeking comfort from me about his continued deceptions. The irony was almost amusing, except for the genuine human pain involved. My phone rang with a call from David, as if he'd somehow sensed that Carmen had been on my mind. We'd been talking regularly since our first dinner together, a friendship that had developed naturally from our shared experience of betrayal and recovery. "How are you feeling about the settlement news?" he asked, his voice warm with genuine concern. "Relieved, mostly," I admitted. "It's finally over. Ryan can't hurt me anymore, financially or otherwise." "That's wonderful, Nat. You deserve to move forward without looking over your shoulder." David paused before continuing. "There's something I wanted to discuss with you, actually. Carmen's been calling me." "I mentioned that she'd been trying to reach you when she stopped by today," I said. "She seems to be realizing that Ryan isn't the man she thought he was." David was quiet for a moment before responding. "She asked if I'd consider helping her with medical expenses for the baby. Not reconciliation, just financial support during the pregnancy and first few months of the child's life." "That's incredibly generous of you to even consider," I said, though I wasn't entirely surprised. David's character had consistently impressed me with its fundamental decency. "I keep thinking about the fact that the baby is innocent in all this," David explained. Whatever Carmen did to our marriage, whatever choices she made, this child didn't ask to be born into such a complicated situation. If I can help provide stability during the early months, maybe that's something positive I can contribute. The moral complexity of David's position was staggering. He was contemplating financially supporting his ex-wife's pregnancy with another man's child because he genuinely cared about an innocent baby's welfare. It was the kind of ethical sophistication that Ryan had never possessed. "What did you tell her?" I asked. "That I'd think about it," David said. "But honestly, I wanted to talk to you first. Get your perspective on whether helping Carmen might interfere with your own healing process." The fact that David was considering my feelings in his decision about Carmen touched me deeply. Our friendship had become important to both of us, but he was willing to sacrifice it if supporting his ex-wife would cause me additional pain. "I think what you're considering is incredibly noble," I told him honestly. "And it wouldn't interfere with anything between us. If anything, it makes me respect you even more." That evening, I had dinner plans with Grace, my younger sister, who'd flown in from Denver for a long overdue visit. Grace had been calling weekly since my divorce began, offering support and perspective from someone who'd known Ryan throughout our entire relationship. Her assessment of my ex-husband had always been more skeptical than mine, and she'd admitted to being relieved rather than surprised when the affair came to light. We met at a trendy restaurant in downtown Phoenix, and Grace immediately zeroed in on the changes she saw in my appearance and demeanor. "You look different," she observed after we'd ordered wine. "Stronger. More like the person you used to be before you got so focused on being the perfect wife." The observation stung because it contained truth I'd been avoiding. In trying to fit into Ryan's world and meet his expectations, I'd gradually lost touch with aspects of my personality that had defined me before marriage. My independence, my willingness to take risks, my comfort with solitude and self-reflection. I think I was trying so hard to make the marriage work that I forgot who I was outside of it, I admitted. When Ryan left, I had to rediscover parts of myself that I'd put aside. Grace leaned forward with the intensity that had made her successful in her career as an investigative journalist. "Tell me about this David guy you've been spending time with. The way you talk about him sounds different from how you used to talk about Ryan." The question made me pause and consider my feelings about David with more honesty than I'd previously allowed myself. Our friendship had developed gradually from shared experience into something deeper and more meaningful than I'd expected. "He's kind in a way that doesn't require recognition or praise," I said slowly. "And he's genuinely interested in my thoughts and opinions, not just how they reflect on him. When I talk to David, I feel heard rather than managed." "That's a pretty significant contrast to your marriage," Grace observed. "Ryan always struck me as someone who viewed you as an accessory to his life rather than a full partner." The accuracy of her assessment was painful but liberating. I had spent years convincing myself that Ryan's self-absorption was just confidence, that his dismissal of my concerns was strength rather than selfishness. Comparing his behavior to David's genuine respect and interest highlighted how diminished I'd become in my marriage. "Are you interested in David romantically?" Grace asked directly. "Or is this just a supportive friendship between two people who've been through similar trauma?" "I've been asking myself the same question," I admitted. "There's definitely potential for something more, but I'm scared of making another mistake. What if I'm just attracted to David because he's everything Ryan wasn't? What if I'm not ready to trust my judgment about men?" Grace considered this concern seriously before responding. "From what you've told me about David, he sounds like he has the emotional intelligence to navigate those questions with you. Maybe the answer isn't to avoid the possibility, but to explore it honestly and communicate about your concerns." The conversation with Grace helped clarify feelings I'd been trying to suppress. My friendship with David had indeed evolved into something that felt like the foundation for romance, but I'd been afraid to acknowledge those feelings because of my recent experience with betrayal and deception. 2 weeks later, David and I had plans for dinner at the same restaurant where we'd had our first conversation months earlier. As I dressed for the evening, I found myself taking extra care with my appearance in a way that felt significant. This wasn't just another friendly dinner between two divorced people. It was potentially the beginning of something new and important. David was waiting for me when I arrived, looking handsome in a way that seemed effortless rather than calculated. When he stood to greet me, there was something different in his expression, a warmth and intensity that suggested he'd been thinking about the evolution of our relationship as much as I had. "You look beautiful," he said simply, and the sincerity in his voice made my heart race in a way I hadn't experienced since the early days with Ryan. "Thank you," I replied, settling into my chair across from him. "You seem different tonight, more relaxed somehow." David smiled with slight embarrassment. "I've been thinking a lot about us, about where this friendship has been heading. I didn't want to pressure you while you were still processing the divorce, but I think we both know this has become more than just mutual support between wounded parties." The directness of his approach was refreshing after months of careful emotional distance. "I've been thinking about it too," I admitted. "I'm scared, David. Not of you specifically, but of trusting my judgment about relationships again." "That's completely understandable," David said, leaning forward with the focused attention that made conversations with him so meaningful. "I'm scared too, honestly. Neither of us planned to fall for someone while we were still recovering from betrayal. But I think we owe it to ourselves to explore what this could become." The word love hung unspoken between us, but its presence was unmistakable. What I felt for David was fundamentally different from my experience with Ryan. Where my marriage had been built on attraction and shared goals, this relationship was growing from mutual respect, genuine compatibility, and the rare experience of being truly seen and appreciated by another person. "I'd like to explore it too," I said quietly, "but I need us to take things slowly. I need to rebuild my confidence in my own judgment before I can fully commit to someone new." David reached across the table and took my hand, his touch gentle but unmistakably intimate. "We'll take it at whatever pace feels right to you. I'm not going anywhere, Natalie. This isn't about filling a void or finding a rebound relationship. This is about building something real with someone I genuinely care about." The conversation that followed was unlike anything I'd experienced in my marriage to Ryan. We talked about our fears, our hopes for the future, our concerns about blending our complicated histories into something healthy and sustainable. David listened without trying to fix or minimize my worries, offering his own vulnerabilities in return. Over the following months, our relationship developed with the careful deliberation of two people who'd learned hard lessons about the importance of genuine compatibility. We spent time together without the pressure of defining our status, allowing intimacy to grow naturally from friendship and mutual respect. David followed through on his promise to help Carmen with medical expenses, contributing to her prenatal care and delivery costs without expecting gratitude or recognition. When Carmen's baby was born, a daughter she named Isabella, David sent flowers to the hospital despite having no legal or emotional connection to the child. His generosity towards someone who'd hurt him profoundly impressed me with its moral sophistication. Ryan, meanwhile, was facing criminal charges for client fraud and the systematic misappropriation of construction deposits. The business empire he'd built over 15 years collapsed completely within 6 months of our divorce, leaving him facing potential prison time and financial ruin. Carmen, struggling to care for an infant while her partner dealt with legal troubles, finally accepted David's offer to help with childcare and support. The strange interconnectedness of our lives continued to evolve in unexpected ways. Carmen, chastened by Ryan's complete inability to provide the stability she'd expected, began rebuilding her relationship with David on a foundation of gratitude and respect rather than romance. David, in turn, developed a genuine affection for Isabella that had nothing to do with her parentage and everything to do with his fundamental decency. One evening, almost a year after that terrible morning when I'd found Carmen in my kitchen, David and I were having dinner at my house when he made an observation that captured how far we'd all traveled from that initial crisis. "It's strange how betrayal can sometimes lead to better outcomes than staying in situations that weren't really working," he said, watching me arrange flowers he'd brought from his garden. "If Carmen hadn't had the affair, we might have stayed married for years without addressing the fundamental problems in our relationship." The perspective was characteristic of David's ability to find meaning and growth in difficult experiences. My marriage to Ryan had been failing long before Carmen entered the picture, sustained by habit and social expectations rather than genuine connection. The affair had forced me to confront truths I'd been avoiding about my own happiness and fulfillment. Do you ever regret how everything played out? I asked, genuinely curious about his emotional processing of our shared history. I regret the pain everyone went through, David said thoughtfully. But I don't regret the outcome. Carmen is better suited to someone like Ryan, even if he turned out to be less reliable than she expected. And you and I might never have discovered what we have together if we'd stayed in marriages that were slowly suffocating us. His words resonated with a truth I'd been gradually accepting. The crisis that had seemed like the destruction of my life had actually been its liberation. I'd been forced to rediscover my strength, rebuild my independence, and ultimately create space for a relationship that offered genuine partnership rather than mere companionship. 6 months later, David proposed during a quiet dinner at the restaurant where we'd had our first meal together. The ring he offered was simple and elegant, chosen with the same thoughtful attention he brought to everything in our relationship. When I said yes, it felt like the natural culmination of a love story that had grown from shared adversity into genuine joy. Our wedding was small and intimate, attended by close friends and family who'd supported us through the difficult transitions that brought us together. Carmen sent a congratulatory card with a photo of Isabella, now a toddler with Ryan's dark hair and David's kind eyes. Ryan, facing a 2-year prison sentence for fraud, wasn't invited and didn't reach out. Holly served as my maid of honor, her satisfaction at the outcome of my divorce proceedings matched only by her happiness at seeing me in a relationship that brought out my best qualities. Grace flew in from Denver with a speech that made everyone cry, talking about how betrayal had ultimately led me back to myself and forward to real love. As David and I exchanged vows in the garden of our new home, a property we'd chosen together that blended both of our aesthetic preferences, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this moment. The woman who'd been devastated by finding another woman in her kitchen had evolved into someone stronger, wiser, and ultimately more capable of both giving and receiving authentic love. David's vows spoke of partnership, respect, and the kind of daily kindness that sustains long-term relationships. Mine focused on gratitude for second chances and the courage to remain open to love, despite the risk of future pain. We were both older and more cautious than we'd been in our first marriages, but also more intentional about creating something lasting and meaningful. The reception was held in our backyard, transformed with the kind of elegant simplicity that had become my signature style as a designer. Fairy lights strung between desert trees, tables arranged to encourage conversation, and food that reflected both of our cultural backgrounds created an atmosphere of warmth and celebration. During our first dance, David whispered in my ear about how grateful he was for the circuitous path that had brought us together. I thought about Carmen, who'd probably never understand that her betrayal had ultimately freed 2 people to find better versions of love than they'd known before. As the evening wound down and our guests departed, David and I stood on our patio, looking out at the Scottsdale mountains silhouetted against the starlit sky. The house we'd created together felt like the physical manifestation of the relationship we'd built, grounded in mutual respect and designed to encourage individual growth within committed partnership. I never did thank Carmen properly for that morning in my kitchen, I mused, causing David to laugh with genuine amusement. Maybe we should send her a wedding photo, he suggested, with a note thanking her for bringing us together through her spectacular lack of judgment. The idea was tempting, but I knew it would be unnecessarily cruel to someone who was already living with the consequences of her choices. Carmen was raising Isabella largely alone while Ryan served his sentence, working at a job that paid a fraction of what she'd earned before the scandal destroyed her reputation in Phoenix's business community. Justice, I'd learned, didn't require additional punishment from me. The natural consequences of Carmen and Ryan's actions had been more severe than anything I could have orchestrated. They'd lost their marriages, their financial security, and their social standing through their own choices, while David and I had emerged from the wreckage stronger and more capable of happiness than we'd been before. Standing there with my new husband, in our new home, looking forward to a future built on honesty and genuine compatibility, I felt something I hadn't experienced since childhood: complete contentment with my life exactly as it was. The crisis that had begun with a missing chair at a birthday dinner in Rome felt like ancient history, a painful but necessary prelude to the real story of my life. David pulled me closer as a cool desert breeze rustled the palm trees in our yard, and I marveled at how betrayal had ultimately led to blessing. I'd learned that sometimes the most devastating losses create space for gains we never could have imagined. Carmen's presence in my kitchen that morning had ended one chapter of my life, but it had also begun the one where I finally understood the difference between settling for acceptable and demanding extraordinary. The woman who'd walked out of that Roman restaurant after discovering there was no chair for her had eventually found her place at a completely different table, one where she was not just welcome but cherished. Sometimes the greatest gift life can give you is the courage to walk away from what you thought you wanted in order to discover what you actually needed. As David and I headed inside to begin our first night as a married couple, I offered a silent prayer of gratitude for the painful lessons that had made genuine happiness possible. Carmen Rodriguez had indeed changed my life by moving into my house and stealing my husband. She'd just done it in exactly the opposite way she'd intended, and for that, I would be forever thankful. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.